Diana had perfected the art of public deception. At dinner parties and social events, she was the epitome of grace, a doting wife and charming hostess. But behind closed doors, her home was a battlefield, and her mother-in-law was her favorite target. Mary, a petite woman in her 60s with soft gray hair and kind brown eyes, had once been the heart of Ethan's life. She had sacrificed everything to send him to college, taking on multiple jobs after her husband's untimely death. But none of that mattered to Diana. To Diana, Mary was weak. "Ethan's success is because of me," Diana would often sneer when Mary tried to reminisce about the sacrifices she had made for her son. "You're just a relic from his past." Ethan, caught between his wife and mother, grew increasingly distant from Mary. Diana's manipulative words seeped into his mind like poison, painting his mother as overbearing and out of touch. He rarely visited her room now, leaving Mary isolated in the mansion that Diana ruled with an iron fist. But Diana's disdain didn't stop there. She made Mary do chores well beyond her physical capacity, like scrubbing floors on her hands and knees or rearranging heavy furniture. Any mistake was met with biting remarks. "You can't even clean properly," Diana spat one evening as Mary struggled to lift a vase filled with water. The vase slipped from her trembling hands, shattering on the marble floor. "Useless," Diana hissed, stepping over the broken glass. "You're nothing but a burden." Mary's only solace came in her faith. Late at night, when Diana and Ethan were asleep, she would kneel by her bed, her frail hands clasped tightly in prayer. She prayed for her son, for strength to endure Diana's cruelty, and for guidance on what to do next. But no matter how much she prayed, her spirit grew heavier with each passing day. One afternoon, Diana found a stack of letters in Mary's room. Letters Mary had written to Ethan, begging him to spend time with her, to remember the bond they once shared. Diana laughed as she held them over the fireplace, watching the flames consume every word. When Mary discovered what Diana had done, she crumpled onto the floor, tears streaming down her face. "You think your little letters will change anything?" Diana taunted, standing over her. "Ethan doesn't care about you anymore. He has me now." For Mary, that moment was a breaking point. She realized she had to do something, not for herself, but for Ethan, who had been blinded by Diana's manipulations. She began gathering evidence of Diana's cruelty, documenting everything in a journal. She wrote about the times Diana lied to Ethan, fabricated stories to turn him against her, and belittled her in ways no one else witnessed. Months turned into years, and Mary endured in silence, biding her time. But she underestimated Diana's vindictiveness. Diana discovered Mary's journal one day, and what followed was a humiliation so severe that it left Mary on the brink of despair. Mary's heart raced as she sat on the edge of her bed, the torn page from her journal still clenched in her hand. Diana's words echoed in her mind, sharp and condescending, like the crack of a whip that refused to stop stinging. The humiliation she felt was unbearable, yet it wasn't new. Diana had spent years chipping away at her, each insult and dismissive glance another brick in the wall of Mary's isolation. The house was silent now, the kind of silence that carried a weight of foreboding. Mary knew Diana would never let this go. The woman thrived on control, on ensuring that everyone around her lived under her thumb. And Mary? She had been the perfect target, quiet, submissive, and unwilling to make waves. But the truth burned in her chest, a secret that refused to be silenced. She stared at the crumpled page, her own words staring back at her in shaky handwriting. It was a small piece of the larger story, one she had written in stolen moments, hidden away like contraband. Each word was an act of defiance, a testament to her inner strength, strength she hadn't even realized she still possessed. Diana's fury over discovering it only confirmed what Mary had suspected for years. The woman feared exposure. She feared the truth. The night crept on, the shadows in her room growing longer as Mary sat motionless. She thought of Ethan, her son, and the man he had become under Diana's influence. He was distant now, his warmth buried beneath layers of ambition and the constant need to please his mother. Mary had tried to reach him, to show him that love didn't have to come with conditions, but Diana's voice always seemed louder. As the clock struck midnight, a faint sound broke the silence, a creak, almost imperceptible, coming from the hallway. Mary's pulse quickened, her body tense. She held her breath, listening intently, her ears straining to catch any other sound. Was it Diana? The woman had a way of lurking, of making her presence known at the most unsettling moments. But when no further noise came, Mary exhaled shakily and tried to steady her racing heart. Sleep was out of the question. Instead, she moved to her desk, pulling open the drawer where she kept the rest of her journal entries. She had hidden them well, wrapping them in an old scarf and tucking them beneath a pile of unused stationery. As her fingers brushed against the familiar fabric, a pang of fear gripped her. What if Diana had already found these two? What if she knew everything? Mary unwrapped the scarf, her breath catching as the stack of pages came into view. Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived. The risk she had taken by documenting Diana's cruelty felt overwhelming now. If Diana was willing to tear one page to shreds, what would she do if she discovered the rest? But Mary couldn't stop. Writing had become her lifeline, the only way she could process the years of neglect and humiliation she had endured. It wasn't just about Diana. It was about Ethan, about herself, about the life she had sacrificed for the sake of her family. These pages were her truth, raw and unfiltered, and she wasn't ready to let them go. The next morning, Mary moved through the house like a ghost, her every action shadowed by the weight of Diana's presence. In the kitchen, Diana sat at the breakfast table, sipping her coffee with an air of superiority that made Mary's stomach churn. Ethan was nowhere to be seen, likely buried in work or too busy to notice the tension that thickened the air like fog. "Good morning, Mother," Diana said with a sugary smile that didn't reach her eyes. The venom beneath her tone was unmistakable. Mary nodded stiffly, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as she fought to maintain her composure. "Good morning." Diana tilted her head, studying Mary with a predatory glint in her eyes. "I trust you've had time to reflect on our little conversation yesterday." Mary's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Yes." "Good," Diana replied, her smile widening. "Because I'd hate for there to be any misunderstandings between us. You understand your place here, don't you?" It took everything in Mary not to let her emotions spill over. She felt the heat of anger rising in her chest, but she swallowed it down, her hands trembling at her sides. "I understand." Diana leaned back in her chair, satisfied. "Wonderful. Let's keep it that way." As Mary left the kitchen, her heart pounded in her chest, her anger and frustration bubbling beneath the surface. She couldn't live like this anymore, tiptoeing around Diana's wrath, pretending everything was fine while the life she had built crumbled around her. Something had to change. That afternoon, Mary slipped out of the house while Diana was occupied with her weekly social gathering. The air outside was crisp and cool, a welcome contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the house. She made her way to a small cafe on the edge of town, where she knew she could think without interruption. Sitting in a quiet corner, Mary pulled out her journal and began to write. Her thoughts poured onto the page like a flood, each word a release of the pain and anger she had carried for so long. She wrote about the years of manipulation, the sacrifices she had made, and the dreams she had buried for the sake of her family. But she also wrote about her resolve, about the woman she wanted to become, the life she deserved to live. As she wrote, a shadow fell over her table. She looked up to see Henry standing there, his expression filled with concern. "Mary," he said gently, "are you all right?" She hesitated, her pen hovering over the page. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I can't keep living like this." Henry pulled out a chair and sat across from her, his gaze steady. "Then don't. You don't have to do this alone, Mary. Whatever you need, I'm here." Mary's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back, a flicker of hope igniting in her chest. For the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't entirely powerless. She had allies, people who cared about her, and the strength to fight for herself. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the town, Mary left the cafe with a renewed sense of purpose. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. Diana may have controlled her for years, but Mary was determined to reclaim her life, one step at a time. Mary's steps were hesitant as she returned to the house that evening, her journal clutched tightly against her chest like a shield. The cool evening air did little to calm her nerves as the house loomed before her, its darkened windows staring back at her like unblinking eyes. She paused at the door, her hand hovering over the doorknob, as though the very act of entering would seal her fate. Inside, the atmosphere was as heavy as ever. The faint murmur of voices came from the living room, where Diana was entertaining guests. Mary's stomach twisted at the thought of facing her again, but she knew she couldn't avoid it forever. Quietly, she slipped upstairs to her room, locking the door behind her. She placed the journal on the bed, her mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. The cafe conversation with Henry had given her a glimmer of courage, but that courage felt fragile now, like a flickering candle against the storm that was Diana. Mary knew Diana wouldn't stop until she was broken, until every ounce of her spirit had been crushed beneath the weight of her dominance. Mary paced the room, her hands wringing together as memories of the past came rushing back. She thought of the years she had spent trying to appease Diana, bending herself into shapes that didn't fit, erasing parts of herself to keep the peace. Every sacrifice, every moment of silence, had led to this, a life that felt like a prison with no escape. Downstairs, the laughter of Diana's guests grew louder, grating against Mary's ears. She froze as she heard her name mentioned, her heart sinking. She crept to the top of the stairs, straining to hear over the pounding of her own heart. Mary has always been delicate, Diana's voice carried, smooth and cutting. She means well, of course, but you know how some people just aren't built for resilience. Laughter followed, polite but biting, and Mary felt her chest tighten. Every word felt like a dagger, her humiliation laid bare for others to mock. She gripped the banister, her knuckles white, as tears blurred her vision. Diana had stripped her of her dignity in private, but now she was doing it publicly, turning her pain into entertainment. Mary retreated to her room, her mind racing. She had tried to rise above Diana's cruelty, to maintain her composure in the face of endless provocations, but this was different. This wasn't just about her. It was about the way Diana manipulated everyone, spinning her web of lies and control until there was no room for truth. That night, as the house fell silent and the guests departed, Mary lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The darkness felt suffocating, the walls pressing in on her as though the house itself was conspiring against her. She thought of her journal, the one piece of herself she had managed to hold on to, and a flicker of resolve sparked within her. If Diana wanted to destroy her, she would have to fight harder than ever before. The next morning, Mary rose early, her exhaustion written across her face. She moved through the house with purpose, avoiding Diana's gaze as she gathered her things. The journal was tucked securely in her bag, along with a few other possessions she couldn't bear to leave behind. She didn't know where she was going yet, but she knew she had to get out. As she descended the stairs, her footsteps hesitant but determined, she caught sight of Diana in the living room. The older woman was seated by the window, a cup of tea in hand, her expression as serene as ever. But her eyes darted to Mary with a sharpness that betrayed her calm facade.
"Going somewhere, Marys?"
Diana asked, her voice light but dripping with condescension. Mary hesitated, her grip tightening on the bag's strap. "Just out for a bit," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Diana set her cup down, rising to her feet with deliberate slowness. "You've been so restless lately. Is there something you'd like to share?" The challenge in her tone was unmistakable, and Mary felt her heart race. She shook her head, stepping back toward the door.
"No.
I just need some air." Diana's lips curved into a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Take all the time you need," she said, her words a trap Mary couldn't quite decipher. "But remember, Mary, the world outside isn't always as kind as it seems. Sometimes, it's better to stay where you're safe." Mary didn't respond. She pushed the door open and stepped outside, the cold morning air hitting her like a slap. Her legs carried her away from the house, but her mind was spinning with Diana's words. They were a warning, a reminder that she was never truly free. She found herself at the cafe again, her hands trembling as she sipped a cup of coffee. The space felt smaller today, less like a refuge, and more like a temporary escape. Henry wasn't there, and the emptiness around her only heightened her sense of vulnerability. As she stared out the window, her thoughts racing, a shadow fell across the table. She looked up to see a man in uniform, a police officer. Her stomach dropped as he addressed her. "Mary Cartwright?" he asked, his tone neutral but firm. She nodded, her heart pounding. "Yes. I'm going to need you to come with me," he said. "We have some questions about a matter involving your household." Her blood ran cold. "What matter?" she asked, her voice shaking. The officer didn't elaborate, but his expression was grim. Mary's mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Had Diana found her journal? Had she twisted its contents into something incriminating? The thought was almost too much to bear. As Mary followed the officer out of the cafe, her legs felt like lead. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see Diana's smug face watching from the shadows. But there was no one there, just the weight of her own fears, pressing down on her like a stone. Mary's breath hitched as the officer guided her toward the waiting police car. The world around her seemed muted, the vibrant chatter of the cafe and the rustling of leaves drowned out by the deafening roar of her heartbeat. She climbed into the back seat, her fingers clutching her bag like a lifeline. The journal was inside, and she couldn't shake the fear that it had somehow led to this moment. The car pulled away from the curb, the officer's silence filling the space between them like a heavy fog. Mary's mind raced with possibilities, each one more dire than the last. Had Diana orchestrated this? Had she found a way to turn the authorities against her? Mary had always known that Diana's reach extended far beyond their home, but the idea that she could manipulate the police sent a shiver down her spine. The drive was short, but it felt like an eternity. When they arrived at the station, Mary was led through a series of corridors, the sterile walls closing in on her with every step. She was guided into a small, dimly lit room and instructed to sit at the lone table in the center. The officer left without a word, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The silence was unbearable. Mary's fingers fidgeted with the strap of her bag, her mind replaying every interaction with Diana over the past few weeks. Had she said something incriminating? Had her journal been discovered and twisted into something it wasn't? The possibilities were endless, and each one felt like a noose tightening around her neck. The door creaked open, and a second officer entered, this one older and with a hardened expression that betrayed no emotion. He carried a file, which he placed on the table before sitting across from her. "Mary Cartwright," he began, his voice low and steady. "We've received a report that raises some concerns about your household." Mary's throat tightened. "What kind of concerns?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The officer opened the file, his eyes scanning the contents. "It seems there have been allegations of misconduct, financial discrepancies, property disputes. We've been informed that there may be documents in your possession that could shed light on these issues." Mary's stomach dropped. It had to be Diana. Only she could twist the narrative to make Mary appear culpable. Her mind reeled as she tried to find the words to defend herself, but the officer's gaze was unyielding. "I don't know what you're talking about," Mary said, her voice trembling. "I've done nothing wrong." The officer leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "We're not here to make any assumptions, Mary. We're just here to get the facts. If you have anything to share, now is the time." Mary hesitated, her grip tightening on her bag. The journal was inside, filled with her innermost thoughts and fears. It was a window into her soul, but it was also a potential weapon in the wrong hands. She couldn't bear the thought of it being used against her. "I don't have anything," she said finally, her voice breaking. "I'm not sure who would say otherwise, but they're wrong." The officer studied her for a moment before nodding. "Very well. We'll continue our investigation and be in touch if we need anything further." He rose from his seat, leaving the file on the table as he exited the room. Mary stared at it, her chest heaving with the effort to hold back tears. The walls felt like they were closing in, the weight of Diana's machinations pressing down on her with relentless force. Minutes later, the first officer returned, motioning for her to follow. Mary rose on shaky legs, clutching her bag as she was escorted back to the front of the station. She was released without further explanation, the vague promise of future contact hanging over her like a storm cloud. The walk home was a blur. The city seemed brighter, louder, mocking her with its normalcy as she trudged through the streets. Her thoughts churned with anger, fear, and frustration. Diana had crossed a line. This wasn't just about control anymore. This was about destruction. When Mary finally reached the house, she hesitated at the door, her heart pounding. She pushed it open slowly, bracing herself for what awaited inside. The air was heavy with tension, and she could hear the faint sound of Diana's voice in the living room. It was calm, measured, as if she were hosting a guest. Mary stepped inside, her footsteps tentative as she moved toward the source of the voice. She stopped short when she saw Diana seated on the sofa, her posture as regal as ever. Across from her sat a man in a crisp suit, his expression cold and professional. A briefcase rested at his feet. Diana looked up, her eyes meeting Mary's with a glint of satisfaction. Mary," she said, her tone dripping with feigned warmth. "You're back. I was just discussing some arrangements with Mr. Caldwell here." Mary's stomach churned. "What arrangements?" she asked, her voice sharp despite her trembling hands. Diana's smile didn't falter. "Oh, nothing for you to worry about. Just some legal matters regarding the estate. It's all rather dull, really." Mary's eyes darted to the briefcase, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Diana was planning, it was designed to leave her with nothing. Every instinct screamed at her to fight back, but the weight of the day's events left her feeling powerless. Diana rose from her seat, her smile never wavering. "Why don't you rest, dear? You've had quite the day, I'm sure. Leave the details to me." Mary's fists clenched at her sides as Diana and Mr. Caldwell moved past her, their departure marked by the faint click of the front door closing. She stood frozen in the empty living room, the echoes of their conversation lingering in the air. She knew Diana was tightening the noose, but she also knew one thing with absolute certainty: she couldn't let her win. Mary stood motionless in the living room, her breathing shallow, the faint sound of the closing door echoing in her ears. The sight of Diana's smug smile and the enigmatic presence of Mr. Caldwell had ignited a storm within her. She could feel the invisible threads tightening around her, pulling her deeper into a web she couldn't yet untangle. She clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms as the weight of the day bore down on her. She moved toward the window and pulled back the curtain just enough to watch as Diana and Caldwell exchanged a few words by the car. Diana's expression was calm, but her sharp gestures suggested an urgency that made Mary's stomach churn. Caldwell nodded, opened his briefcase briefly, then snapped it shut before sliding into the driver's seat. Diana lingered, her gaze drifting toward the house, as if she knew Mary was watching. Mary let the curtain fall back into place, her heart pounding. What was Diana planning? What arrangements could possibly require a lawyer's presence in the middle of an ordinary day? Questions swirled in her mind, each one more suffocating than the last. She felt trapped, as though the walls of the house were closing in, leaving her with no escape. She paced the living room, her mind racing. Diana's earlier smugness wasn't just about control. It was a declaration of war. Mary thought back to the officer's vague accusations at the station, the tension in his voice as he mentioned financial discrepancies. It had to be connected. Diana was planting seeds of doubt, manipulating the narrative to paint Mary as the villain. Her hands trembled as she sank into the worn armchair near the fireplace. She stared at the cold hearth, its emptiness mirroring the hollowness she felt inside. Memories of happier days in this house, the laughter, the shared meals, the moments of peace, now felt like distant echoes. Diana's shadow loomed over every corner, turning the once cozy space into a battlefield. As night fell, Mary forced herself to move. She needed answers, and she needed them now. She retrieved her journal from her bag, her fingers brushing over the worn leather cover. It held her private thoughts, her fears, and, most importantly, a detailed account of every interaction with Diana since the day they met. If Diana wanted to twist the truth, Mary would fight back with her own version of it. She opened the journal and flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the entries. Each word was a reminder of the torment Diana had inflicted, subtle jabs disguised as concern, backhanded compliments, and veiled threats that eroded Mary's confidence over time. It wasn't just manipulation, it was psychological warfare, a calculated effort to strip Mary of her agency. A sudden knock at the door startled her, and the journal slipped from her hands, landing on the floor with a soft thud. Her breath hitched as she stared at the door, her heart pounding. She wasn't expecting anyone, and after the day she'd had, every knock felt like a potential threat. Slowly, she rose and approached the door, her footsteps hesitant. She peeked through the peephole and froze. Standing on the porch was a woman she didn't recognize, tall, with sharp features and an air of authority that made Mary's stomach twist. Mary opened the door a crack, her voice cautious. "Can I help you?" The woman's expression was unreadable, her tone clipped. "Mary Cartwright? My name is Linda Graves. I'm here on behalf of Caldwell and Associates. May I come in?" Mary's grip on the doorknob tightened. "What is this about?" "It's regarding some property disputes that have come to our attention," Linda replied, her words deliberate. "It's in your best interest to discuss this sooner rather than later." Mary's heart sank. Property disputes. Diana was already making her move. Mary stepped aside reluctantly, allowing Linda to enter. The woman walked in with an air of confidence, her sharp gaze taking in the room as though cataloging every detail. Linda placed a sleek black folder on the coffee table and gestured for Mary to sit. "Let's get straight to the point," she began, her tone professional but unyielding. "There are claims regarding your use and management of the Cartwright estate. Mrs. Diana Cartwright has expressed concerns about your actions, and she's asked our firm to mediate." Mary felt a surge of anger rise within her. "Concerns," she said, her voice trembling. "She's lying. I've done nothing wrong." Linda's gaze didn't waver. "That's for the courts to decide. However, if you'd prefer to resolve this amicably, Mrs. Cartwright has proposed a settlement. It would require you to vacate the property and relinquish any claims to the estate." The words hit Mary like a physical blow. Relinquish the estate? Vacate the property? This was her home, her sanctuary, and Diana was trying to take it away. Mary's fists clenched at her sides as she fought to keep her composure. "This house belongs to me," she said firmly. "Diana has no right to take it." Linda's expression softened slightly, but her tone remained measured. "I understand this is difficult, but these disputes can get messy. It's in everyone's best interest to avoid a prolonged legal battle." Mary stared at the folder, her mind racing. Signing away the estate would mean losing everything. It would mean admitting defeat, giving Diana exactly what she wanted. But fighting back would mean stepping into the ring with someone who had already proven she could manipulate the system. "I need time to think," Mary said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Linda nodded and rose from her seat.
"Take the weekend," she said.
"But understand this. The longer you wait, the harder it will be to reach an agreement." As Linda left, the door clicking shut behind her, Mary sank back into the armchair, her mind a whirlwind of fear and defiance. Diana's plan was unfolding rapidly, but Mary wasn't ready to give in. She couldn't. Not yet. She needed to find a way to turn the tide before it was too late. Mary sat frozen in the armchair long after Linda had left, her mind spinning with questions and fears. The dim light of the living room cast long shadows on the walls, making the space feel smaller, more oppressive. The folder sat on the coffee table like an ominous presence, daring her to open it. She wanted to rip it apart, to throw it into the fireplace and watch it burn, but she knew that wouldn't solve anything. Diana had made her move, and now it was Mary's turn to figure out how to respond. Her phone buzzed on the side table, breaking the heavy silence. She reached for it hesitantly, her heart skipping a beat when she saw an unknown number flashing on the screen. Her thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before she answered. "Hello," she said, her voice barely steady. A familiar voice responded, cold and calculated. "Mary, it's Diana." Mary's grip on the phone tightened, her pulse quickening. "What do you want, Diana?" Diana let out a soft chuckle, the sound sending a shiver down Mary's spine. "I just wanted to make sure you received the message loud and clear. I told you this house doesn't belong to you, and now you have proof." Mary clenched her jaw, her anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "You can't just waltz in and take what isn't yours. This house is mine, Diana. You have no right." "Oh, but I do," Diana interrupted smoothly. "You see, I've been preparing for this moment for a long time. You, on the other hand, seem woefully unprepared. Tell me, Mary, how does it feel to lose?" Mary's breath hitched, the weight of Diana's words cutting deep. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but the truth was, Diana's confidence unnerved her. There was a certainty in her tone, a sense of control that made Mary feel as though she was already playing a losing game. "I won't let you win," Mary said finally, her voice trembling but resolute. Diana's laugh was sharp, almost mocking. "Win? Oh, Mary, this isn't a game. This is survival. And you've already lost. Enjoy your weekend. I imagine it will be your last in that house." The line went dead, and Mary stared at the phone in her hand, her chest heaving with a mixture of anger and fear. She threw the phone onto the couch and buried her face in her hands, the overwhelming weight of the situation threatening to crush her. Every word Diana had spoken felt like another brick added to the wall closing in around her. She glanced at the folder again, the sight of it igniting a spark of defiance within her. She couldn't let Diana win. Not like this. She reached for the folder, her hands shaking as she flipped it open. Inside were pages of legal documents, each one meticulously crafted to paint her as the antagonist in this battle. Financial discrepancies, questionable transactions, and even a claim that she had neglected the property. All lies, but lies wrapped in just enough truth to make them dangerous. Her heart sank as she scanned the documents, realizing just how deeply Diana had planned this. It wasn't just about the house, it was about destroying her completely. Mary felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Crying wouldn't help her now. Instead, she grabbed her journal and began flipping through the pages, searching for anything that might counter Diana's claims. Each entry was a painful reminder of the battles she had fought with Diana over the years, but it was also a testament to her strength. She had endured so much already. This was just another storm she had to weather. As the night wore on, the exhaustion began to set in. Mary leaned back in the chair, her eyes heavy, but her mind still racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that Diana wasn't done yet, that there was more to this plan than just the documents in the folder. Every move Diana had made so far had been calculated, designed to back Mary into a corner. And Mary knew that whatever came next would be even more devastating. She was startled awake by a loud banging on the door. Her heart leapt into her throat as she scrambled to her feet, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. The banging came again, more insistent this time. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Who would be at her door at this hour? She approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. Her stomach dropped when she saw two police officers standing on the porch, their expressions grim. She hesitated for a moment before opening the door, her voice shaky. "Can I help you?" she asked, her heart pounding. "Mary Cartwright," one of the officers asked, his tone formal. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to ask you some questions regarding a report filed against you. May we come in?" Mary's blood ran cold. A report? What report? Her mind raced as she stepped aside, allowing the officers to enter. They looked around the living room, their eyes lingering on the folder and the scattered pages on the coffee table. "We received a report of financial misconduct involving the Cartwright estate," the officer continued, his gaze fixed on her. "We're going to need you to come down to the station to answer a few questions." Mary's legs felt like jelly, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She wanted to protest, to demand answers, but the weight of the situation left her speechless. The officers were calm but firm, their presence a stark reminder of how far Diana was willing to go. As they escorted her out of the house, Mary couldn't help but glance back at the living room. The sight of the empty space filled her with a sense of dread. She felt as though she was being led away from more than just her home. She was being stripped of everything she had left. The cool night air hit her skin as she stepped outside, her eyes adjusting to the flashing lights of the police car parked at the curb. She spotted a figure standing in the shadows across the street, watching the scene unfold. Her heart sank as she recognized Diana, her silhouette illuminated by the glow of her phone. Diana's lips curled into a satisfied smile, and Mary felt a surge of anger rise within her. This wasn't just about the house or the estate. This was personal. Diana was determined to destroy her, to leave her with nothing. But as the police car pulled away, Mary made a silent vow to herself. She would fight back. No matter how much Diana tried to break her, she would find a way to rise again. The ride to the station was silent, except for the occasional crackle of the police radio. Mary sat in the back seat, her hands trembling in her lap. The weight of the night pressed heavily on her chest, every moment amplifying her sense of helplessness. The city lights blurred through the car window, and she felt as though she were trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Diana's smirk was still etched in her mind, a cruel reminder of just how calculated this all was. When they arrived at the station, the fluorescent lights inside felt harsh and sterile. Mary was led to a small, windowless room where the walls seemed to close in around her. The officer who had spoken to her earlier set a recorder on the table and handed her a cup of water. His tone was measured, almost sympathetic, but it did nothing to calm her nerves. "We're here to gather information, Mrs. Cartwright," he began. "You're not under arrest, but it's important that we clarify some details regarding the report filed against you." Mary swallowed hard, her throat dry despite the water. "What report?" she asked, her voice cracking. "What exactly am I being accused of?" The officer glanced at the file in front of him, his brow furrowed. "The allegations pertain to financial misconduct. There are claims that you've been mismanaging funds from the Cartwright estate, specifically using assets for personal gain while neglecting your legal obligations." Mary's heart sank. She knew exactly who had orchestrated this. "That's not true," she said, her voice firm despite the panic bubbling beneath the surface. "I've done nothing wrong. This is a setup." The officer raised an eyebrow. "A setup? By whom?" "Diana Cartwright," Mary said without hesitation. "My late husband's mother. She's been trying to take the estate from me since the day he passed. This is her doing?" The officer exchanged a glance with his colleague, his expression unreadable. "Do you have any evidence to support that claim?" Mary faltered. "Evidence?" Diana had always been careful, weaving her web of deceit with precision. "I don't have concrete proof," she admitted. "But I know her. This is exactly the kind of thing she would do." The officer sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Without evidence, it's difficult to take this as anything more than speculation. The report we received is detailed and well documented. It's not something we can dismiss lightly." Mary's chest tightened, a fresh wave of fear washing over her. Diana had covered her tracks well, and now Mary was the one under scrutiny. She could feel the walls closing in, the noose tightening around her neck. The questioning continued for hours, each inquiry digging deeper into her financial records and her handling of the estate. Every answer she gave felt like a gamble, the weight of her words heavier than she could bear. By the time they let her go, the first rays of dawn were creeping over the horizon. Stepping out of the station, Mary felt hollow, her legs weak beneath her. The world outside seemed distant, as though she were walking through a fog. She knew Diana had orchestrated this perfectly, leaving her scrambling for answers while the clock ticked against her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, jolting her back to reality. She hesitated before answering, her fingers shaking as she swiped the screen. It was Linda. "Mary." Linda's voice was urgent. "I just saw the news. Diana's making statements to the press." She's calling this a necessary intervention to save the Cartwright legacy. Mary's blood ran cold. She's doing this publicly? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Linda replied. She's painting you as irresponsible, even unfit. Mary, you need to act fast. This isn't just about the house anymore. She's trying to destroy your reputation. Mary closed her eyes, the weight of the situation threatening to crush her. Diana wasn't just targeting her finances. She was dismantling every aspect of her life, piece by piece. I don't know what to do, Mary admitted, her voice breaking. She's thought of everything. I don't have a way out. There has to be something, Linda said firmly. Some leverage, some piece of information you can use against her. Mary's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of fear and desperation. She thought back to the years she had spent in the Cartwright family, the secrets she had uncovered, and the whispers she had ignored. Diana's power wasn't just in her wealth, it was in her ability to manipulate and control. But power like that often came with skeletons, and Mary knew there had to be something Diana didn't want exposed. I'll think of something, Mary said finally, her voice trembling but resolute. I have to. The next few days were a blur of tension and dread. The media coverage of the scandal grew louder, with headlines painting Mary as a reckless widow squandering her late husband's legacy. Diana's calculated narrative gained traction, and Mary felt the world turning against her. But amidst the chaos, a sliver of hope emerged. While sifting through old documents in her attic, Mary stumbled across a folder she didn't recognize. Inside were papers, letters, and photographs, evidence of a scandal that could tarnish Diana's carefully curated image. Her hands shook as she pieced the story together, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Diana's perfect facade wasn't as flawless as it seemed, and Mary now held the key to exposing her. As she stared at the folder, a plan began to form. It was risky, but it was her only chance to turn the tide. Diana had underestimated her, and Mary was determined to show her that she wasn't as invincible as she believed. Mary's hands trembled as she stared at the folder, its contents spread out on the small desk in her dimly lit attic. The faint light from the single bulb overhead cast long, flickering shadows, giving the room an eerie stillness. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the incriminating evidence in front of her. Letters written in Diana's unmistakable, elegant handwriting. Financial documents that hinted at dubious dealings. Photographs that told stories no one was supposed to see. Every piece was a fragment of a larger, darker picture, one that Mary hadn't fully comprehended until now. She carefully picked up one of the photographs. It was of Diana, much younger, seated beside a man Mary didn't recognize. Their body language was intimate, their smiles too knowing for mere acquaintances. The background revealed a lavish event, one Mary knew had taken place during Diana's first marriage. The date scrawled on the back confirmed her suspicions. Diana had been entangled in an affair long before her husband's death, a secret she had managed to bury for decades. And yet, this was just one piece of the puzzle. The documents suggested something far more sinister: embezzlement, fraud, and possibly connections to figures that could ruin her reputation forever. Mary's breath quickened as she pieced it together. Diana wasn't just vindictive, she was dangerous. Her manipulations weren't confined to the personal sphere, they extended to financial and social empires, built on lies and deceit. For years, Diana had used her wealth and influence to crush anyone who dared to oppose her, and now, Mary was her latest target. A wave of panic surged through Mary as the weight of what she'd uncovered sank in. She wasn't just holding a few damaging secrets, she was holding a loaded weapon. The wrong move could backfire catastrophically. But as fear coursed through her veins, it was quickly replaced by a simmering determination. Diana had underestimated her for far too long. It was time to fight back. Mary spent the next hours meticulously organizing the evidence. She scanned the documents, creating encrypted digital copies and saving them in multiple locations. She couldn't afford to lose this leverage, and she couldn't risk anyone discovering it prematurely. Every click of the scanner felt like a heartbeat, steady and deliberate, a rhythm that steadied her nerves. By dawn, Mary was exhausted but resolute. The attic was suffused with the pale light of morning, a stark contrast to the dark storm brewing in her life. She gathered the originals, tucked them safely back into the folder, and locked it away in a small safe hidden beneath the floorboards. As she replaced the rug that concealed the compartment, a knock at the front door startled her. Her heart raced as she descended the creaking stairs, the sound echoing in the otherwise silent house. Peering through the peephole, she froze. Standing on her porch was Diana, dressed impeccably as always, her expression a calculated mask of calm. Behind her, two men in suits loomed, their imposing presence sending a chill down Mary's spine. Mary opened the door just enough to speak, her voice strained but steady. "What do you want, Diana?" Diana's smile was thin, her eyes sharp. "Good morning, Mary. I thought it was time we had a little chat. May I come in?" Mary hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to refuse. But refusing Diana outright would only escalate matters, and she needed time to think. Reluctantly, she stepped aside, allowing Diana and her entourage to enter. Diana's gaze swept over the modest living room, her nose wrinkling slightly in disdain. "Charming," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. She settled herself on the sofa, crossing her legs elegantly, while the two men remained standing, their presence a silent threat. Mary stood near the doorway, her arms crossed tightly. "Say what you need to say and leave." Diana's smile faltered, replaced by a look of feigned concern. "Oh, Mary, always so defensive. I simply wanted to extend an olive branch. This unpleasant situation has gone on long enough, don't you think?" Mary's jaw tightened. "Unpleasant situation? You mean the lies, the smear campaign, the attempt to ruin my life? That situation?" Diana's expression hardened, her mask slipping for just a moment. "I'm offering you a way out, Mary. Drop your claims to the estate. Sign over everything, and I'll ensure this unfortunate matter with the police disappears." Mary's stomach churned with anger and fear. "And if I refuse?" Diana leaned forward, her smile returning but colder than ever. "If you refuse, I will bury you. The press will tear you apart. You'll be left with nothing, not even your dignity." The threat hung in the air, suffocating and absolute. Mary's mind raced. She couldn't let Diana see the cracks in her resolve. She straightened her spine, meeting Diana's gaze with as much defiance as she could muster. "You don't scare me, Diana." Diana's laughter was soft and chilling. "Oh, Mary, that's where you're wrong. You're terrified. And you should be." With that, she rose gracefully, signaling for her men to follow. At the door, she paused, looking back at Mary with a glint of triumph in her eyes. "You have until the end of the week to make your decision. Choose wisely." The door closed behind her, and Mary stood frozen, her body trembling with a mix of fear and fury. Diana's words echoed in her mind, a relentless reminder of the battle she was fighting. But as the weight of the encounter settled over her, Mary's resolve only grew stronger. Diana had pushed her into a corner, but Mary wasn't backing down. As she locked the door, her gaze drifted to the attic. The evidence was her weapon, and the clock was ticking. Diana had given her a deadline, but Mary would be ready. She wasn't just fighting for the estate, she was fighting for her life, her dignity, and her freedom. And she would stop at nothing to ensure Diana's reign of terror came to an end. Mary spent the rest of the day in a haze, her thoughts a storm of fear, anger, and determination. Diana's visit had been a calculated move, a reminder of her reach and power. The threat was clear. If Mary didn't comply, Diana would obliterate her. But what Diana hadn't anticipated was how her threats would only fuel Mary's resolve. For too long, Mary had let fear dictate her actions, but now, she felt a flicker of something else. It wasn't courage exactly, it was defiance. As the hours passed, Mary busied herself with preparations. She combed through every piece of evidence she had, ensuring there were no gaps. Each document, photo, and recording felt like a lifeline, a fragile thread connecting her to the truth. Her fingers trembled as she placed the items in an unassuming manila envelope, one she planned to send to a trusted contact in the media. She wasn't ready to expose Diana yet, but she needed insurance in case something happened to her. By nightfall, the atmosphere in Mary's small house had shifted. The once comforting walls now felt suffocating, the faint creaks and groans of the old structure amplified in the silence. She double-checked the locks on every door and window, her paranoia growing with every shadow that danced across the dimly lit rooms. Diana's parting words echoed in her mind, a sinister refrain. "You're terrified. And you should be." Sleep was out of the question. Mary sat by the window, peering out into the darkened street. The neighborhood was quiet, the occasional flicker of a porch light or passing car the only signs of life. But Mary couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her gaze darted to the corner of the block where a black car had been parked for hours. Its windows were tinted, the interior shrouded in shadow. She had noticed it earlier but had dismissed it as a neighbor's visitor. Now it felt like something more. Her phone buzzed, startling her. The screen lit up with a message from an unknown number. "Tick-tock, Mary." Her breath caught, her grip tightening around the phone. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. She stared at the message, her heart pounding, and immediately deleted it, knowing it was a warning. But from whom? Diana? Or someone else in her tangled web of threats and lies? The next morning, Mary ventured out of the house, her envelope tucked securely in her bag. She avoided her usual routes, doubling back several times to ensure she wasn't being followed. Every pedestrian felt like a potential threat, every passing car a source of danger. The paranoia was suffocating, but she couldn't afford to falter. She reached a small, independent courier service, choosing it specifically for its discretion. The clerk, a young man with kind eyes, assured her the package would be delivered to her contact within 24 hours. Mary's hands shook as she handed over the envelope, her voice barely steady as she said, "It's important. Please make sure it gets there." Leaving the courier, she felt a momentary sense of relief, but it was fleeting. As she turned the corner, her eyes locked onto a figure standing across the street. It was one of the men who had accompanied Diana the day before. He was leaning casually against a lamppost, but his gaze was fixed on her, unflinching and predatory. Panic surged through her, but she forced herself to keep walking. She couldn't afford to let him know she had noticed. The encounter haunted her for the rest of the day. She replayed it over and over, wondering if Diana had planted someone to trail her, or if this was her mind playing tricks on her. That night, she sat in the darkness of her living room, clutching a kitchen knife for comfort. Her thoughts were a chaotic swirl of doubt and fear. Was she being paranoid? Or was Diana truly tightening her grip, inching closer to snuffing her out? The next day brought no reprieve. Mary received another message, this one more direct. "You can't win, Mary. Stop now." The words were like a dagger to her chest, but beneath the fear, a spark of anger ignited. Diana was playing a game of intimidation, but Mary refused to fold. She would see this through, no matter the cost. She reached out to her contact at the media, a journalist named Lauren who had built a reputation for exposing corruption. They arranged to meet at a nondescript cafe on the outskirts of town. The meeting was tense, both women speaking in hushed tones as they discussed the evidence. Lauren's eyes widened as Mary revealed the extent of Diana's misdeeds. "This is explosive," Lauren said, her voice tinged with both awe and caution. "But you realize what this means, don't you? Diana won't just sit back and let this happen. You're putting yourself in real danger." "I already am," Mary replied, her voice firm. "But this needs to end. She can't keep destroying lives." They agreed to move forward cautiously, with Lauren promising to verify the documents before publishing. Mary left the cafe with a mix of relief and dread. She had taken a step closer to exposing Diana, but the risks were greater than ever. As she drove home, the feeling of being watched returned. Every car in her rearview mirror seemed suspicious. Every turn she made felt followed. By the time she reached her house, her nerves were frayed. She parked in the driveway and hurried inside, locking the door behind her. The house was eerily quiet. Mary moved through the rooms, checking every window and door, but something felt off. A faint scent lingered in the air, something floral and expensive. Her blood ran cold. It was Diana's perfume. Her heart pounded as she scanned the room, her eyes landing on a single item placed deliberately on the coffee table, a black envelope. She approached it cautiously, her hands trembling as she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message written in elegant script. "I told you to choose wisely. Time's up." Attached was a photograph of Mary leaving the courier office, the envelope in her hand clearly visible. Mary sank onto the couch, the weight of the threat crashing down on her. Diana was always one step ahead, her reach extending further than Mary had imagined. For the first time, she felt the flicker of doubt creep in. Could she really win this battle? Or had she already lost? The answer felt as elusive as the shadows closing in around her. Mary sat frozen, the photograph trembling in her hands as the reality of her situation clawed at her chest. The image was unmistakable, her own reflection captured mid-step, her face pale and anxious, the envelope clutched tightly to her chest. Diana's message was clear. There was no escape, no corner of Mary's life that wasn't under her watchful gaze. Her breathing quickened as paranoia sank its claws deeper. She bolted upright, her eyes darting around the room as if Diana herself might emerge from the shadows. Every creak of the old house felt louder, more menacing. She grabbed her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed Lauren's number, but the call went straight to voicemail. Panic surged. What if Diana had already intercepted the journalist? What if she knew everything? Mary's mind raced with worst-case scenarios. She had gambled everything on exposing Diana, but the stakes had spiraled far beyond her control. If Diana could track her movements so easily, what else could she do? The thought was suffocating, the weight of it pressing down on her like a physical force. She dropped the photograph and stumbled to the window, peering through the blinds. The street outside was quiet, but the stillness felt wrong, artificial. She swore she saw movement near the black car parked down the block, the same one she had noticed days earlier. Was it paranoia, or was she being watched? Her phone buzzed, the sudden noise making her jump. It was a message from another unknown number. "You're not safe at home. Leave now." Her blood ran cold. Was it a warning or a trap? She stared at the message, her instincts warring with her fear. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to run, but where could she go that Diana's influence wouldn't reach? The sound of a car door slamming outside shattered her thoughts. Her chest tightened as she moved to the window again, careful to stay out of sight. A figure emerged from the car, tall, broad-shouldered, and unmistakably one of Diana's men. He stood there, scanning the house with a cold, methodical gaze before speaking into a phone. Mary couldn't hear his words, but his presence alone was enough to send her into a frenzy of preparation. She grabbed a small bag she had packed days earlier, filled with essentials in case she needed to disappear. Her mind raced as she tried to anticipate her next move. She couldn't go to the police. Diana's reach extended too far, and the thought of involving authorities felt futile. But she couldn't stay here either. Her hands trembled as she zipped the bag shut, her breath shallow and rapid. As she moved toward the back door, her foot caught on the edge of the rug, sending her sprawling. Pain shot through her wrist as she hit the floor, the sound of her fall echoing through the empty house. She froze, her heart pounding as she listened for any sign that the man outside had heard. The silence was oppressive, each second stretching into an eternity. Then, the sound of footsteps on the porch shattered the quiet. Mary scrambled to her feet, clutching the bag to her chest as she backed away from the door. The footsteps were deliberate, unhurried, as if the person on the other side knew they had all the time in the world. The doorknob rattled, sending a jolt of fear through her. She darted toward the stairs, her mind screaming at her to stay quiet. The sound of the front door unlocking made her stomach drop. They had a key. Of course they did. She reached the top of the stairs just as the door creaked open. The sound of heavy boots on the hardwood floor made her pulse race. She pressed herself against the wall, her mind frantically searching for an escape route. The window at the end of the hallway was her only option. She moved toward it, careful to avoid the creaky floorboards, but her movements felt painfully slow, her body weighed down by fear. Below, the intruder moved with purpose. Drawers opened and closed, the sound of objects being shifted and tossed echoing up the staircase. They were searching for something, her most likely, or perhaps the evidence she had sent. She reached the window and fumbled with the latch, her hands slick with sweat. The old frame groaned as she pushed it open, the noise making her wince. She peered out, her heart sinking. The drop was too far, but there was a narrow ledge she could use to inch toward the fire escape. It was risky, but staying inside was worse. She swung one leg over the windowsill, her body trembling as she tried to steady herself. The cool night air hit her face, sharp and biting, but it was a relief compared to the suffocating tension inside. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made her blood run cold. She didn't have time to hesitate. Gripping the edge of the window, she hoisted herself onto the ledge, her body pressed flat against the wall. The fire escape was only a few feet away, but the distance felt insurmountable. She inched along the ledge, her breath shallow as she tried to ignore the dizzying height. The window she had just climbed through slammed open, and she glanced back to see the man's shadowy figure leaning out, his gaze locking onto her. "There's nowhere to go, Mary," he called, his voice calm but menacing. "Come back inside and we can talk." Her heart pounded as she ignored his words, focusing on the fire escape. She reached it just as the man leaned further out, his hand reaching for her. Adrenaline surged through her, giving her the strength to pull herself onto the metal platform. She didn't look back as she scrambled down the ladder, her feet hitting the ground with a jarring thud. The street was eerily empty, but she knew she couldn't linger. She darted into the shadows, her mind racing with a single thought. She had to stay ahead, no matter what it took. Mary's breaths came in ragged gasps as she ran, the cold night air stinging her lungs. The city around her felt unfamiliar, its looming buildings and dark alleyways turning into a labyrinth of shadows and danger. Every sound, a car engine, a dog barking, the distant chatter of pedestrians, set her nerves on edge, her mind unable to distinguish between ordinary noise and the threat of pursuit. She ducked into an alley, her back pressed against a damp brick wall as she tried to gather her thoughts. The faint glow of a street lamp illuminated the edge of the alley, casting eerie shadows that danced with a slight wind. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone, the cracked screen flickering faintly. She knew she had to call someone, but who? Everyone she could think of felt too far away, too unreachable in this moment of suffocating isolation. Her thumb hovered over Lauren's number again, but she hesitated. If Diana's network had intercepted her messages before, what was stopping them now? She couldn't risk exposing anyone else to this nightmare. Lowering the phone, she leaned her head against the wall, closing her eyes as tears threatened to spill. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on her chest, each breath a struggle. A noise from the entrance of the alley jolted her from her thoughts. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing off the narrow walls. Her heart leapt into her throat as she pressed herself further into the shadows, her hand instinctively reaching for a loose brick she'd noticed earlier. Her fingers closed around its rough edges, her pulse pounding in her ears. The footsteps grew louder, and then a figure appeared at the edge of the light. It wasn't the man from earlier, but he had the same calculated presence, a cold, methodical way of moving that screamed of Diana's influence. He paused at the entrance, scanning the alley, his sharp gaze sweeping over every shadow. Mary held her breath, her body frozen as she willed herself to remain unseen. The figure moved further into the alley, his hand resting on his hip in a way that made her stomach twist. Was he armed? She tightened her grip on the brick, her knuckles turning white. She couldn't let him find her. Not here. Not now. As he moved closer, a sudden clatter from a trash can further down the alley made him whip around, his attention diverted for just a moment. Mary didn't hesitate. She darted out of her hiding spot, her footsteps as silent as she could make them. She ran toward the opposite end of the alley, her heart racing as she prayed he wouldn't turn around in time. She was almost at the end when she heard him shout, his voice sharp and commanding. "Stop." The word cut through the night like a blade, but she didn't dare look back. She burst out onto the main street, her eyes scanning frantically for a place to hide. The street was busier than she expected, filled with late-night commuters and groups of friends heading home. The normalcy of it felt surreal, almost mocking in its contrast to her desperation. Blending into the crowd, she kept her head down, her bag clutched tightly against her chest. The figure from the alley emerged a moment later, his head swiveling as he searched for her. Mary ducked into a coffee shop, the warm light and chatter of customers offering a brief reprieve from the suffocating tension. She sank into a seat near the back, her body trembling as she tried to steady her breathing. A waitress approached, her friendly smile faltering as she took in Mary's disheveled appearance. "Are you all right, miss?" she asked softly. Mary forced a nod, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just a coffee, please."
Black.
The waitress hesitated but eventually walked away, leaving Mary to her thoughts. She glanced toward the window, her eyes scanning the street for any sign of the man who had chased her.
He was gone for now.
But the reprieve felt fragile, like a thin layer of ice over deep, freezing water. Her coffee arrived, and she wrapped her hands around the warm cup, the heat grounding her slightly. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together her next move. She needed a plan, a way to stay ahead. The data Diana wanted was her only leverage, but she had no idea how to use it without putting herself in even greater danger. As she sipped the bitter liquid, a sudden thought struck her. What if Diana wasn't just after the data? What if this was about more than just her betrayal? The thought made her stomach churn. Diana was meticulous, calculated. She wouldn't expend this much effort unless the stakes were higher than Mary realized. Her phone buzzed again, and she flinched, nearly spilling her coffee. She pulled it out, her hands shaking as she read the message on the screen. "You're running out of time. Meet me at the old warehouse on 9th. Come alone." Her chest tightened. The number was unfamiliar, but the urgency in the message was undeniable. She didn't trust it, but what choice did she have? The walls were closing in, and every move felt like a gamble. She stared at the screen, her mind warring with itself. If it was a trap, it could be the end. But if it wasn't, it might be her only chance to turn the tide. Setting the phone down, she took a deep breath, steeling herself. She didn't have the luxury of hesitation. It was time to face whatever lay ahead, even if it meant walking straight into the lion's den. Mary sat in the coffee shop, her pulse racing as she reread the text message. The words felt like an ultimatum, heavy with hidden implications. Her mind swirled with doubt and fear. Could she trust this mysterious invitation, or was it another trap carefully set to corner her? Her fingers trembled as she tightened her grip on the phone, her gaze flickering to the window. The bustling street outside felt like a distant world, oblivious to the chaos consuming her life. The message wasn't just urgent, it was chilling. "Come alone," echoed in her thoughts, each repetition raising more questions. Who was waiting at the warehouse? Was it Diana, a pawn of hers, or someone else entirely? Every possibility felt like walking into a nightmare. Yet, Mary knew she couldn't stay stagnant. Moving forward, even into danger, seemed better than suffocating in this limbo of fear and uncertainty. She paid for her coffee and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at her skin. Pulling her coat tighter around her, she slipped into the crowd, her steps deliberate but her heart pounding. The address burned in her memory, a destination that felt both ominous and inevitable. Each step closer to the warehouse felt heavier, her senses hyper-aware of every noise, every shadow. She kept glancing over her shoulder, certain she was being followed but too afraid to stop and confirm her suspicions. The streets grew quieter as she neared the edge of the industrial district. Streetlights flickered, casting erratic pools of light on the cracked pavement. The air smelled of rust and damp concrete, the silence broken only by the occasional hum of a passing car or the distant bark of a dog. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, the tension mounting with every passing second. When the warehouse came into view, it loomed like a relic of forgotten times, its corrugated metal walls streaked with rust and grime. Broken windows reflected the faint moonlight, giving the building an eerie, hollow gaze. Mary hesitated at the entrance, her hand hovering over the rusted handle. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but the weight of her circumstances pressed her forward. She pushed the door open, the groaning hinges echoing into the cavernous space. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and faint shafts of light spilled through broken skylights above. The space was vast, filled with the remnants of machinery long abandoned and piles of debris that cast distorted shadows on the walls. Every sound seemed amplified, the creak of the floor beneath her feet, the distant drip of water, the faint rustle of unseen movement. "Hello," Mary called, her voice breaking the silence. It echoed back to her, distorted and ghostly. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she forced herself to step further inside. Her eyes darted around, scanning for any sign of life, any hint of who had sent the message. Then she heard it, a faint shuffling sound from the shadows. Her body tensed, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it could be heard. A figure emerged, their steps slow and deliberate. The dim light revealed a man in his late 30s, his face partially obscured by the hood of his jacket. His sharp eyes locked onto hers, and a chill ran down her spine. "You made it," he said, his voice low and steady. He stepped closer, and Mary instinctively backed away, her body screaming for distance. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound strong. The man stopped, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. "I'm here to help. But you need to listen carefully." Mary crossed her arms, trying to mask her fear with defiance. "Why should I trust you? I don't even know who you are." The man sighed, pulling back his hood to reveal a face worn with exhaustion and faint scars that told of a life lived on the edge. "My name is Eric," he said. "I used to work for Diana. I know what she's capable of, and I know what she's after." His words struck her like a physical blow. The confirmation that Diana's reach extended even here made her stomach churn. "And what does she want from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eric hesitated, his gaze dropping for a moment. "The data you have, it's more than just evidence. It's a key. If she gets her hands on it, she'll have the power to erase everything. Her crimes, her network, her control. She'll disappear, untouchable. But you're the only one who can stop her." Mary felt the weight of his words settle on her like a crushing burden. "Why are you telling me this? Why now?" Eric's jaw tightened, and he stepped closer, his voice lowering. "Because I've seen what happens to people who cross her. I've seen what she'll do to protect herself. And I can't let her keep getting away with it." Before Mary could respond, the faint sound of tires screeching outside snapped both their heads toward the entrance. Eric's expression darkened. "She's here," he said. "We don't have much time." Panic surged through Mary as Eric grabbed her arm, pulling her deeper into the warehouse. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice shaking. Eric's gaze was intense, his determination unyielding. "We fight back. But first, we have to get out of here, alive." Eric led Mary through a narrow passage at the back of the warehouse, his movements quick and deliberate. The sound of car doors slamming and muffled voices echoed behind them, growing louder with every second. Mary's heart raced, her fear threatening to paralyze her, but Eric's grip on her arm anchored her in the moment. They emerged into a small, dimly lit room filled with old filing cabinets and scattered papers. Eric shut the door behind them, locking it with a heavy bolt. He motioned for Mary to stay quiet as he pressed his ear to the door, listening intently. Her breaths were shallow, her chest heaving as she tried to suppress her panic. "They'll search the entire building," Eric whispered, pulling out a small flash drive from his jacket pocket. "We need to destroy their leverage before they find us." Mary stared at the device, her mind reeling. "What's on it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Everything Diana doesn't want the world to see," Eric replied. "Proof of her operations, her connections, and how she's manipulated people like you to cover her tracks." A surge of anger replaced Mary's fear. The thought of Diana using her pain and humiliation for her own gain made her blood boil. What do we do with it? We get it to the authorities, Eric said firmly. But first, we have to get out of here. A loud crash from somewhere in the warehouse jolted them both. Mary's pulse quickened as Eric grabbed her hand, leading her toward a concealed exit at the back of the room. He pushed open a hidden panel, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. This leads to an old maintenance tunnel, he explained. It'll take us out of the building. Mary hesitated, glancing back at the door. What if they find us before we make it? Eric met her gaze, his expression resolute. Then we make sure they don't. They descended the stairs quickly, the air growing colder and more oppressive as they moved deeper underground. The faint sound of voices and footsteps echoed from above, a constant reminder of the danger closing in. Mary's fear mixed with a newfound determination. She couldn't let Diana win. The tunnel was narrow and damp, the faint glow of Eric's flashlight guiding their way. Mary's mind raced as they moved, memories of Diana's cruelty and manipulation surfacing like ghosts. Every insult, every calculated move to undermine her, now felt like pieces of a larger puzzle, a puzzle she was finally starting to understand. "Why are you helping me?" Mary asked, her voice breaking the tense silence. Eric's gaze softened. "Because I've seen too many people destroyed by her. I can't undo what I've done, but I can make sure she doesn't hurt anyone else." Before Mary could respond, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber, where faint light seeped through a rusted grate overhead. Eric stopped, studying the space. "We're almost out," he said. "The exit is just beyond this." But as they approached the grate, a shadow moved on the other side. Mary froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound of a gun being cocked echoed through the chamber, and Diana's cold, sharp voice cut through the silence. "Going somewhere, Mary?" Mary turned slowly, her heart sinking as Diana stepped into view, flanked by two armed men. Her expression was as cold and calculating as ever, her eyes gleaming with triumph. "You've caused me quite a bit of trouble," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "But it ends here." Eric stepped in front of Mary, his stance protective. "You can't stop this, Diana," he said. "We have the evidence. It's over." Diana's smile was chilling. "You think a few files will bring me down? You underestimate how far my reach goes." Mary's fear gave way to anger. She stepped forward, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Your reach ends here, Diana. You've built your empire on lies and pain, but you don't control me anymore." Diana's smile faltered, and for the first time, Mary saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Bold words," Diana said, her voice hardening. "But words won't save you." Before Diana could give her men an order, Mary reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She held it up, the screen displaying a live stream that had been running since they entered the tunnel. "You're right, Diana," Mary said, her voice filled with quiet strength. "Words alone won't save me. But the world is watching now." Diana's expression twisted into one of fury as she realized what was happening. The live stream had captured everything, her threats, her admission of power, and the faces of her armed men. The authorities would have all the evidence they needed to bring her down. "You think this will stop me?" Diana hissed, her voice venomous. "It's a start," Mary replied, her gaze unwavering. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with every second. Diana's men exchanged nervous glances, their confidence faltering. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the tunnel as law enforcement closed in. Diana glared at Mary, her composure cracking. "This isn't over," she spat before turning and disappearing into the shadows, her men following close behind. As the police arrived, Eric stepped forward to explain the situation, handing over the flash drive with the incriminating evidence. Mary watched as the officers moved to secure the area, her heart heavy but her spirit lighter than it had been in years. For the first time, she felt free. Over the weeks that followed, the fallout from Diana's exposure was immense. The evidence Mary and Eric had provided led to arrests, dismantling Diana's network piece by piece. Mary watched from afar as the woman who had tormented her was brought to justice, her empire crumbling under the weight of the truth. But Mary's journey wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming her life, her voice, and her strength. She returned to her art, channeling her pain and resilience into powerful works that spoke to her journey. And as she stood in her studio, surrounded by the vibrant colors of her creations, she realized that she had found something Diana could never take away: peace.